So, who are you and what do you do?
So, my name is Malissa Clark, and I'm an associate professor at the University of Georgia. I study industrial organizational psychology.
So, let's talk a little bit about what industrial organization psychology is for those who don't know.
Yeah, so it's the study of people at work, really. We take psychological principles and we apply them to the workplace to hopefully make the workplace a better place for everyone involved. We do some of the more technical stuff, like more the HR side, but I'm more in the realm of the people side. So I study employee well-being, broadly speaking. So anything under that realm, really just to try to improve the experience of work for the workers.
And did you ever work in the corporate world, or are you primarily an academic by trade?
I'm primarily an academic. I went straight into academia after graduate school. So my work experience was before graduate school. I did take a break between undergrad and grad and worked in a couple different sales jobs. That's where my career started. And I was like, I don't think I can do sales for the rest of my life. So I need to switch gears. And that's when I decided to go back to school.
So, when you're taking your work and people are applying it to their business, do you see a gap between what's happening in the academic research versus how it's deployed and then surprises in terms of reactions to it? I'm always fascinated by that because I work with a lot of academics. I love speaking to academics. And then it's the real world's a very different place than survey studies and what people think.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like sometimes when I'm talking to my academic colleagues, we just get into the jargon and debate about sometimes really silly things, like what's the definition of this? And let's tease that apart. And then when I speak to individuals, podcasters or people in organizations, they're like, just tell me how this is relevant for me. I really don't care how you define this, but just tell me broadly what it is and how can we apply it?
Yeah.
So very different ways of thinking and talking about really everything. And it's much more practically oriented, which makes sense, right?
Yeah.
When we leave academia, we want to be able to apply the research.
It's a bit of a different world though now. I find that both academic and those in the corporate world are intermingled. Often you'll see very successful corporate executives come into academics and vice versa. Do
Hmm.
you see that changing the field and how it works? I'm thinking back to the day when I first published my book, probably mid 2000s, and this idea of, oh, it's never going to be included into a college program because it hasn't been vetted. And there's this whole process around it. It feels like those types of things are loosening up. And I'd also submit that it's probably interesting to see things like the Harvard Business School's case study strategy being deployed as a marketing strategy, let's say in the real world.
Hmm. Yeah, definitely. I guess I see that changing into the ways you're talking about. In our master's program, for example, they hire half of their faculty are academics like myself, and I teach in there, and then the other half are practitioners. And so, especially with my field of industrial organizational psychology, there's a big rise in the number of master's programs around the country. And so, especially for training master's students, we see a lot more integration of people that are, in the real world, working full time in their jobs and kind of teaching on the weekend. And that really does bring that practical experience. And there's also a big mass exodus of industrial organizational psychologists from academia to applied. And I maybe won't get into the reasons for that, but I definitely see that as a huge trend right now.
Yeah. I think a lot of it comes from the show Billions. They have that character that's the psychologist therapist who's now working in the company. It probably has to do with things like that, right? Where
Oh, I haven't seen that. I'll have to check it out.
look, ultimately, I think organizations want to bring in this type of academic and this type of psychology to how do we create better performers, healthier performers, and things like that. I'm sure that's part and parcel of it. It's a very hot topic.
Right. Yeah, I mean, especially coming out of COVID, we see organizations, claiming that they're much more invested into employee well-being, which I hope is the case. Hope it continues to be the case. And so, there's many of my colleagues and friends who have moved into those roles in organizations. And also big, people analytics is another pretty popular career path for IO psychologists.
So the reason why I reached out to you, Melissa, to have this conversation is one, I saw that you also made the Thinkers Radar list, which I got a couple years ago.
I saw that in your bio. Yes.
Yeah, always great to see. Love Thinkers 50 and all the stuff they're doing there, and it provides a good grounds for me to meet new thinkers and people who are thinking differently about work. And then seeing the title of your new book, Never Not Working. I think it's one of those titles where you look at it and go, "Ooh, that's me," or you look at it and go, "Ooh, that's my boss," or you look at it and go, "Ooh, those are my coworkers." It's amazing that you can create a book title with 3 words that might hit somebody emotionally in a myriad of ways. I'm sure.
So did that speak to you personally?
Well, it's an interesting thing. I really think about where my passion lies. And in some strange way, I'd probably be some type of anomaly or perfect definition of some of the terms you use in the book, only because I really do love talking about business and work. At the same time, I'm privileged enough to have a result of all the things you would encourage people to do to get to that place, meaning I can set my own calendar. I can decide the type of things I want to do day in and day out. But I love it. I mean, I really do love it, not from an hour perspective or an intensity perspective, but why we do this. I find it amazing. When I did have my business before we sold it, I would always say, I think business is really personal, right? Everyone would tell you, don't be personal, just business. I'm like, I'm spending 10 hours a day here, staying away from my family and friends and fun things that maybe I would rather not do, but I enjoy doing this, but I'm going to take it personally if I'm going to be here.
Right. So, we spend so much of our lives at work, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it was during a time when the technology was really racing along, and I was definitely riding that wave as well. So let's talk a little bit about what you mean when you say ideal workers, so we can at least level set on that idea, and then we can discuss and debate and argue and agree.
Yeah, definitely. So the term ideal worker comes from sociology, really talking about the devotion to work schema that we have. And really, it's this idea that the ideal worker is someone who prioritizes work above everything else. So themselves, their family, their friends, and is always available to the organization. They're, always just a phone call or a text away. They'll drop everything to handle a work problem. So it's really about this, constant devotion, and work is top priority. And in our culture, in a lot of cultures, this is still what we tend to embrace and really put up on a pedestal, as this is the model of how you can be a great worker.
So what would be your definition of an ideal worker?
What would be my definition? I'm not against hard work. I have always worked really hard my whole life. Identifying as someone who's like a recovering workaholic, I guess you could say. But I also enjoy my job. I love it. I love meeting new people and talking about this kind of thing. And so, like you, I really do love my work. And so I think that's great to have. I think having passionate, engaged employees is what you want. But I also think that sometimes that can be taken to the extreme. And if your employees are not prioritizing their health and their well-being, they're not going to be the best workers for you. So they might seem like the best workers at the time, but eventually it's going to catch up with them. So the ideal worker in my mind is someone who is very passionate about their job and works very hard when they're there, but also is balanced, and has a life outside of work as well. And it makes someone a more well-rounded person too. And so bringing that into work can be a really beneficial thing as well.
There's been a recent meme on TikTok. I don't know if it's come across your desk as of yet. I'll explain to you the original video and then the stitch that followed.
Okay.
Original video was a manager executive who was talking about an employee that they let go because they had booked an 8 a.m. meeting, and the employee told their boss that they are going to the gym and they were booked to work out and that they will not be attending this meeting. Have you seen this meme or not?
No, I haven't. Mm-mm.
And so there was a lot of head shaking, and it's TikTok, some incredible comments below. The individual who was let go, I guess, saw this and realized it was them. It was anonymous, obviously. And then they came on and said, "Oh, I'm this employee. And look, I'm contracted to work between 9 and 5. I had paid to go to this gym class and didn't want to be either compensated for it or told why this meeting was so important that I had to be in early.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not being compensated for that hour to come in from 8 instead of 9." Went down this litany, and I found the discourse in the comments overly satisfying because it's funny, but
Mm-hmm.
really interesting that there was such polarization. There was nobody in the middle. Either you were saying, "Hey, you're young, you're starting off this new job, sacrifices are important, showing up." And again, I'm going to remove the idea that we don't know the context. Is this boss a great boss, a crappy boss? Is this boss constantly stressing people out and doing crazy things? Or was this truly an emergency, a one-off? I mean, I think there's so many circumstantial components that fall around it as someone who was a business owner that often, we know or we don't know. And often sometimes it's not even information I can necessarily tell the employee. It's just really, really important.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't clear if this employer was not caring of the person's well-being or beyond. It seemed like they were, I'll call them fairly, they didn't look like a crazy person who's just always yelling at their employees, but we don't know the
You
truth.
never know. Yeah.
It is something where I thought, one, is this generational? Is this geographical? Is this an outcome of the pandemic? Because you speak a lot about the pandemic, and I think it is a very interesting conversation around what the pandemic did to us as employees. Armchair quarterbacking something like this. I'm wondering your thoughts because I'm sure you've heard similar stories, so it's not like this is an anomaly.
Right. Yeah, I guess. I mean, like you said, it's so hard to know the context. And so it kind of would depend on that, really. I think if this was a one-off, that this was not a regular request and this was a super important client, maybe it's their busy time and the boss is making this one request, which is out of the, not an, it's an exception, not the rule, right? Then I might lean more on the side of the boss, right? But if it's something that is a regular occurrence and the boss is constantly trying to expand the work hours of this gentleman, then I do think he needed to put some boundaries down and communicate with his boss that, look, it's not okay. I'm not being paid for this. This is not what I'm supposed to work. And so if that were the case, then I would side with the employee. So it really does kind of depend. I didn't really give you a straight answer, but yeah.
No, I think about it a lot and I struggle with it. I think some of it is cultural. I think about when I was just starting out, and maybe it's not constantly being on top of it, but I thought, here's a real way to differentiate myself. Be the person that shows up, be the person that's available, not to the detriment of my own life, but to the betterment of it. That I was
or so you thought, right?
Yeah, but I was being cognizant of my professional development. I think I had a level of confidence in my skills and knowing that this is a stepping stone to something else. And I do wonder how I would think about it. I would have probably swallowed it and gone to the meeting and been a team player, also because I had a philosophy my whole time about work, which was I've agreed to the signed contract. Meaning I wasn't the person where 6 months in, I was like, where's my raise? And I want this. It's like, I knew what my salary was. If I did well, I would hope that they're being ethical. And if it wasn't, I would hope that there would be an open dialogue around what the path might be if this is what my expectations are.
Right.
And I do find, having worked with a lot of different generations in terms of running even a marketing advertising agency, which has its own burnout and stress component to it, that you would see people who were very much in it for themselves versus even trying to be a part of the culture. And I think that's the other part where when you say no and other team members see people saying no, if it's a healthy situation, like we're saying, it's an erosion of culture. It's an erosion a little bit, I think, or it could be a bit of a crack where the water can get in type of thing.
Yeah. Yeah, and I would have done the same thing, I think, as you, especially early in my career. I'm sure I would have just gone to the meeting. It really probably wouldn't have crossed my mind to say no, to be honest.
Yeah.
I am seeing a little bit of that with the freshmen that I teach about, really, really prioritizing their personal well-being. And so I do wonder what it will be like when they get into the workforce and kind of move into these leadership roles. It's almost like they might start out with this idealized version of what work is, but then do they just kind of conform to the status quo and then turn into the bosses they thought they would never be? I don't know. Time will tell. But I wonder about that.
Yeah, I was watching a clip the other day. It's probably going a little bit viral, by Simon Sinek, talking about this newer generation of employees, especially post-COVID. And he makes some really good points. Some of it was taken, I think, from what I've read in terms of Sherry Turkle and Bowling Alone. This idea that community was typically found in places like your church or synagogue. Then you had them within where you lived. Then you had communities within families and friends. And perhaps you'd go somewhere like the local library, and that was another place of community. And through some weird evolution of who we are, work became all of those things. And I think we even saw it at scale prior to the pandemic, where you'd see campuses like Google or Facebook, where I was there, and it looks like you're in a city. They look like store shops, like the coffee shops.
We have everything there.
And why would you leave when they're doing your dry cleaning, and you can have a mindfulness retreat there, and you can get a massage, and you can have your dental work done in a trailer out back from the local dentist? Like, yes, they were giving you reasons not to leave and to stay, but they were also creating an environment that perhaps these individuals didn't have because they moved from other parts of the world. So I could see both the good and the nefarious in it. I think it's a worthy conversation. But then the pandemic hits, and then we all go home and we're working without a lot of these amenities. Do you see a structural difference in business pre and post? Because in reading the book, my gut instinct was you feel like it's, if not the same, maybe even worse, which is interesting.
Yeah, I do. I don't really have a great answer to that. I am seeing, some distinct differences in terms of people's desire to even go back to that sort of environment. The Googles that in the Facebooks that have the everything you need there. I guess I do see your point about this is a community, and it does, we want that community. We, our psychological innate needs, one of them is about relationships. And so it fulfills that need. And, how is that need being fulfilled if everyone's kind of scattered around? But I do think there's other ways to foster that doesn't involve the extreme environments of everything is at work and you don't have to leave. I've really mixed feelings about that. I love all the amenities and the great things that are offered to employees, but I do worry at the same time that environment was kind of really encouraging this ideal worker norm and not really giving people much space for a life outside of work. I don't know. Are we ever going to go back to that sort of workplace environment fully? I don't know. Maybe not. I just feel like remote work is so prevalent now, and there's a real resistance to going back. And we see that, right, with organizations that are pulling back the remote work and implementing these, you have to be at work this number of days a week, and the resistance to that. And so people don't want to go back to that, it seems. Right. But where are they going to find their community is the other opposite end of the coin, right?
What's your gut instinct on this? why are businesses calling them back to office, and why would there be resistance? If you were to spitball this, or maybe you have data and research into it, why do you think this is happening? I'm really fascinated by this topic because here we sit in 2024 and we think it's all rear view mirror, but it feels
Mm-hmm.
like the actual structural changes of what happened are only starting to maybe start landing just now.
I think it's that we still tend to really want to be able to see what all of our employees are doing. This idea of we worship, the ideal worker by the number of hours they put in, and how can we possibly see that they're a dedicated worker if they're not here and I can't see them? And so I personally don't love the policies that are being reversed right now, and mandating a certain number of days per week people need to be in the office, because I'm not really seeing any data to support why that is necessary. People are as productive, if not more productive, when they're working remotely. They're much happier with their work-life balance. A lot of people report they're much healthier in terms of being able to fit in exercise during the day and all of that. And so I really wish organizations wouldn't, kind of just go back to the status quo. Like, well, this was an anomaly during the pandemic and we got to go back to normal. But why? The pandemic taught us that we can be productive working remotely, and people can be, brought into the fold as a new employee and socialized in different ways. Why do they have to be socialized in the same way, having to put in that face time? So I don't know. I don't really know if I answered your question, but I'm not loving the mandates that are coming out right now.
I think often of this question, which is, do we know what's good for us? I think
Mm-hmm.
about the role of a coach, where a coach will essentially, hopefully, pull out things from you that you didn't even know you had in you.
Mm-hmm.
That when you're starting off your career, you may think you're productive, getting the job done, checking the to-do list. But are you actually working on your professional development and missing cues and moments and just overhearing things that make you wealthier in terms of a more
Mm-hmm.
holistic approach to what it is? I think about leaders who might be hopping from individual Zoom to individual Zoom versus a bit of a cross-functional ability to walk across the office and go, Melissa, I know you're working on this, but I heard something here.
Mm-hmm.
There's so many layers to it that, of course, we have overcome historically, because I myself worked in a business that had 30 plus countries and different offices. But the system was somewhat unanimous. Meaning, if I went to
Mm-hmm.
visit the office, whether I'm in Montreal to Toronto, or if I went to San Diego, or if I went to Latin America, these are different businesses that were brought together under the banner of one brand
Yeah.
that seemed culturally truly connected, that there was a bit of a North Star. And I struggle with understanding if that could be done purely remotely. I
Yeah.
struggle with all of it, but I'm more fascinated by the fact that if we had this moment in time that forced us to all work like that, I don't know that we have optimized our people for that. Right? Meaning, we had freelance people who were just really good at being freelance people. They could build their own business, they could do their own thing. I don't know if the average person who's suddenly working remotely, who's doing their to-do list on Zoom, has really benefited from learning and evolving what it means to actually be a remote employee, because it's a very different
Mm-hmm.
thing.
Right. Yeah, probably not, because we were all thrown into it, right? And a lot of us weren't really given any training about how to be productive in a virtual environment. I mean, me personally, we were kind of just thrown into, hey, switch your class to completely on Zoom
Right.
from a fully in person environment and do it next week. And, nobody had time for any sort of training or prep or creative thinking about how to best, how to make that environment the best it could be. So I'm sensing from your hesitation that you're not fully convinced that we could do, all remote, that we need some in-person time. And I'm not saying I totally disagree. I totally get how I can see the other side of the coin, right?
Yeah.
I think there's ways to do it, but yeah, I definitely see both sides.
I'll tell you where I think of a lot. I think about the fact that my kids, who were definitely younger than post-secondary education, went into online learning, and it was an unmitigated disaster to put a 5 to maybe even 18-year-old in front of a Zoom screen all day, especially if they haven't been that exposed to screens, was just a setup for addiction problems in terms of screen time, in terms of understanding it. I would amplify that by saying you're exactly right, that suddenly they're using Zoom and Google Classroom, and it was completely ineffective. And my frustration with the ineffectiveness of it is that we've actually solved for this. If you look at things like Masterclass and online learning, like, we know that in order to create a great online experience, there's a ton of things that can be done,
right?
Instead of trying to replicate the classroom through a camera. So that would be one instance where I thought, if we're going to keep going down this road, let's say your world, my recommendation would be, you want to see who is selling the best online courses in the world and replicate and help the educators understand what they're doing on the community side, on the gathering side, on how they do it, because they are 100% remote, but people feel extremely connected to those quote unquote communities.
Right. Yeah, that's what you need to replicate. Yeah.
And then on the other side, I think a lot about, I was in the music business for a long time. So when people talk about, do you have to go or can't you experience it? My answer is, you tell me. When you listen to the best U2 album ever in your headphones and by yourself in the dark, there's something extremely magical about it. But I would guess that if you bought a ticket and went to see U2 live at the Sphere, you would have a completely different experience. And it's not an either or. It's the fact that a live experience, me and you in a physical room, the energy of the room is very different than even us doing this remotely.
Yeah.
And so I look at it more like that, where people are trying to choose a position without actually saying, look, in the world, we have many great experiences. Like, I know listening to an album is an amazing personal experience. I also know that going to a concert is an awesome experience, but wholly different from that. And I feel like it's a weird thing where we have this challenge of not understanding that. You can look at the Mona Lisa as many times as you want on Google Images, but go walk into the Louvre and tell me if it's the same experience.
Yeah. Yeah. Wouldn't it be great if we could just, if people really wanted to be fully remote and that's their ideal work situation, and everyone in the company, that was kind of how they felt, but the times when people spent together could be doing amazing fun things, like going on an offsite vacation, company wide, right? And just kind of bonding on these personal levels. I do feel like that's what's hard to replicate in Zoom, is bonding on the personal level, right? Yeah. It's just, it's just different, right? But if people can bond on a personal level with their colleagues, I do think that can sustain that relationship a long time, right? And then they can be better teammates, better colleagues. They have more empathy for the other person because they understand and know them better on a personal level. I do think that empathy component is really critical, to be able to put yourself in your customer's shoes, your supervisor's shoes, your employee's shoes, and having that personal connection really builds that empathy. So how can we, build that in a virtual world? I don't know. Maybe we do need that physical connection, but does it always have to be just going to the office? Does that build personal connections? I don't know, especially if everyone's resentful of having to be there. Yeah, maybe they can complain about that together.
Right. Well, what I've seen as somebody who predominantly goes out and speaks beyond the startup that I have, is it feels like events are now more that.
Yes. Our conference. Yep. Our annual conference is so fun. We look forward to it. We call it Nerd Spring Break. And it's not like spring break like you would think, but it is just bonding with all your friends that you haven't seen in a year. And it is just the best time. I look
Yeah.
forward to it every year. Yeah.
And so I do
Events,
feel,
conferences.
yeah, I do feel that associations and organizations are thinking more about how to use those physical gatherings as a way to create connection because they know that people are remote and hybrid more than ever.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing I've heard from very senior executives and organizations that are studying this is one is it's easy to just say productivity is up and productivity is down. I think the definition of productivity is fundamentally different organization to organization. So it's hard to get a real beat on what that is. I know people like the government will use terms like just how many hours are worked or whatever it might be. And the general sentiment on these 3 days on, 2 days off or whatever it is that productivity is terrible because when people come to the office, it's like Monday morning, but times 20. So
Yeah.
usually Monday morning, you come in, you grab your coffee, you chat a little bit, and then you get to it. But because they don't see each other that often, it's almost like all that time is spent doing that. And what happens is, in an effort to get people to return to office, what you're essentially doing is killing their productivity. You can't book meetings. Nobody's showing up because people are just hanging out and trying to get to know
Yeah.
one each other better. So I'm not saying that that's not a way to increase productivity, but from the business's perspective, they feel like they're losing days all the time when people actually even do come to the office,
Yeah.
even though they want them there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So
That's a
it's
really
really
good
interesting.
point. Yeah.
It's like a strange, strange new world of this. Can we talk a little bit about how you reconcile the ideas of never not working with what seems to be a unique moment in time? Here we are in this poly crisis. There's wars, there's climate change, there's all this stuff going on, and yet the economy really seems to be thriving. As an investor, I can tell you things are great in a world where things are not great. What's that reconciliation between the need, and I'm putting air quotes around this, to push this economy forward faster with these changing work habits, or even pushing it further and saying, let's say we deployed fully across all work, all the recommendations you provide in never not working. How do you think it would play out?
Well, if you could implement everything that I talk about in the book, I would be very encouraged. I'm a big proponent, for example, of the 4-day week. And it's not cramming 40 hours into 4 days. It's literally lopping off a day of work. So 8 hours. So working 32 hours, getting the full paycheck, right? Um, that would be one thing, so that we can really be productive when we are at work, but allowing a lot more time for rest and recovery. I talk about a lot of different things like changing our communication patterns and habits. With technology, we're tethered to work all the time, and I'm guilty of this too. Checking my email on my phone, pulling my laptop on my lap when I'm watching a TV show. Really, just kind of gotten into those habits, those bad habits. And so part of what I talk about is kind of breaking that communication cycle of responsiveness that we have now, where we expect a response from people and then we feel pressured to respond. The idealization of hours worked as the ideal worker, that's the metric of productivity. We have all of this technology that makes so much of our jobs easier and faster. I mean, I know you talk about AI, and AI going to continue to make tasks that would take us a couple hours be like instantaneous, and we're shaving off. And we've been doing this for years, for decades, with our computer programs that we can run a statistical analysis in a couple seconds. Used to take my advisors a day or two. They had these little punch cards and they would have to do that to run a factor analysis. And we can just write the code and run it in a couple seconds. So why are we continuing to be in this mindset of 40 hours is the work week? We work 5 days a week and we have to continue to stretch out the work week to fill that time. Why can't we just think about work differently? Why can't we work smarter and just maximize the time we have? And then we can maximize all this time outside of work to help not only just our health and well-being, but it actually helps us to be better workers when we come to work. We're more engaged, we're more rested, we're recovered. And so I actually would be thrilled if some of these things that I talk about in my book could actually be implemented on a wide scale basis, because the problem is you can't do it just a little bit here and there. It has to be almost that we change the way we think about work as a culture, as a society, which obviously is very difficult to do. But hey, we're talking about a perfect world, so I would be thrilled.
Well, but you say, we're talking about a perfect world and it seems so obscure, but I actually don't. I think that if you consider the pandemic
Mm-hmm.
and the fact that we were all forced to work at home
Mm-hmm.
and the fact that people picked up hobbies and started doing things that don't have this hustle to it. Before that, it
Right.
was
Everyone's
whatever you're
baking
doing.
bread and
Yeah.
like walking a lot.
Right. I'm not trying to sell it on Etsy or
Right.
whatever it might
Right.
be.
Not,
Like they were,
not turning into a side business.
so you had that.
Mm-hmm.
You have now people who, what was it, 8 to 12% of these employees couldn't go back to work because they physically moved from the location they were at.
Yeah. Yeah.
You've seen what I would only think of maybe to the degree of people coming home from World War II, this massive shift in perspective of the economy and work.
Mm-hmm.
All of it very aligned with some of the core ideas in Never Not Working. I would submit that if we can't get it now, what makes us think we would ever get it then? Like it does
Yeah, I
feel like
agree.
this is like, how do we?
This is the perfect time.
But with that, you are seeing companies that would be tech savvy, tech forward, doing things like taking more space, imploring return to office strategies, having done the work and saying, we actually feel people are better when they're together, or we see a merit in having these. And this is where I vacillate on everything you write and what I believe so deeply in, and then go, well, we've had several decades of work here to optimize this system. You have these very forward-thinking tech companies that were trying to reinvent work as we know it. And a lot of them are deploying these quite archaic strategies of what work is.
Yeah.
And I guess that's where the rub hits me. If we're not going to deploy Never Not Working now, when? If not now, when,
right.
type of thing.
Yeah. I mean, it's pretty much exactly what I say in the book too. I feel like we just need to think about this as a perfect time to try some experimentation.
Yeah.
Right. So try it out. Try for 6 months with some of these new, they're not new. I'm not the first one to say a lot of these things too. But try some of these different ways of working. Try, implementing things like the 4-day week for 6 months and just really devote those efforts to seeing how your productivity is, how your employees feel. I mean, the data is overwhelmingly positive with these trials, by the way, so looking at pre and post assessments, looking at objective data about company revenue, during the most recent set of trials for the 4-day week, the revenue went up. Employees were much more satisfied. Almost every single employee wanted to keep with this new system. And this is during the Great Resignation too. Turnover went down. Yeah. And I find this interesting. I think it was about 15% of employees said that no amount of money would convince them to go back to the way it was. No amount of money. And I'm seeing some of this with the resistance of going back to work. A company has a return to work mandate and the employee just quits. I think it is that idea of you can't, pay people enough sometimes. They really, truly want this, so.
So the Great Resignation was interesting too, because we had a moment in time where it happens rarely, I would think, that you have the employees with the power, not the employer with the power.
Right. Yeah.
The factor that I would say trumps that is the economy.
Mm-hmm.
And if I think about the economy now, we talked about, for investors, it's going quite well, but on the ground, it feels like the pendulum is swinging back to the employer.
It does. Yeah.
We have
with all the layoffs
rates,
and
just interest rates going up and the price of food and housing. Again, one could go into conspiracy theories about there must be a unified group of people doing this so that employees get back in line. I'm not that person. I do look at this though and feel that I wonder how many employees, if we actually did survey them, would say that I wouldn't go back for no amount of money now. And it's not, it's only a short time after. Like we talk about the great resignation that, much in the same way we talk about only getting a COVID test if your cough is dry versus like, early days of COVID.
Yeah.
Do you worry that we might have already lost perhaps the advantages that we were having in those moments in time? Or do you think that it's still very fresh?
I feel like it's still fresh. I do feel like another thing COVID did was have, kind of this reckoning moment for a lot of people about what is truly the most important thing. Loved ones passed away, so many horrible things, and realizing, why am I, putting so much of my time and energy into work when that's actually not the most important thing to me. So I do feel like people haven't forgotten that. And so there is still, in my opinion, time and space and opportunity for continuing that sort of mindset of how can we make work better for everybody, for companies and employees, and really focus on what's most important ultimately at the end of the day. There's this book that I reference in mine called like the top 5 regrets of the dying. I forget the exact title or the author, but the second most regretted thing was that they worked too much. Is this what you want to be thinking about when you're dying? Do you really, so I guess just thinking about this, the bigger picture, like what are we all doing here? Like what you said, we love our work. It is what gives us a lot of joy and fulfillment, but also can we still have that and all these other things? And I think yes.
Do you think the real way we could see the deployment of these ideas and never not working would best be done if it were done through union government regulation? I think corporate culture is one thing. We should be empathetic. We should be all the buzzwords that we use in business, DEI. Do we need to look in a more hardened way at unions getting involved in this and government regulation being a part of this? Or is that just, we're never going to see that happen? That would be a ridiculous statement to make.
I don't really know the answer to that. I feel like, when you look at a lot of European countries, they have, at a national level,
mandated.
What?
It's mandated. You see the
education exactly.
system, even before work. Yeah.
Yeah. And there's so many things that we're falling behind on a national level. Like we're the only industrialized nation to not have paid parental leave. And that's just sad. It's really just sad. And so I do think there are some things that do need to be at the national level. And I do think, more of that needs to happen. Even with unions, though, that's still not taking it to the ultimate level of like the government kind of mandating some of these policies. So it seems to be working quite well in some of our European counterparts. So maybe we can look to them as models. I think that's going to be a hard sell here in the US. And so I'm not sure if that's something that will happen, that, a mandated 40 work week or something at a national level. I don't know. Probably not. I tend to be naturally pessimistic about some things. But, I do think you need support at all levels.
Let's talk about the individual now. Let's talk about the person who might be listening to this and wondering, do I have workaholism? Am I being overworked? Is this burnout? Do I know even what well-being should look like in my world based on what my parents told me? And I'm in my second job and my employers seem to sound a lot like my parents in terms of hard work and culture, and we need you to be dedicated. I don't, I haven't really sat down with many business owners and the sweetest ones, and they've been saying things like, we don't really want hard workers. We want, I think they might say that in a press release, but when they're talking about it, it's like, there's a lot that needs to get done here. We're all feeling very overwhelmed.
Mm-hmm.
And again, your book is a great guide to this because there's some great questionnaires in there and ways in which you could look at it. But help just somebody listening to this maybe self-evaluate a little bit. What are the real things they should be looking at in both their behavior and perhaps what they're seeing in work?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, people hear the term workaholism and they think, well, this is just like a catchy term. What does this even mean?
Right.
It's really about working compulsively and excessively. So the excessive part is the work hours, right? You work long hours. You bring work home with you all the time. But it's more about these internal drivers as well. So there's a motivational component. You feel like you ought to be working all the time, that you should be. You feel guilty or anxious or unsettled when you're not working. That's the emotional component. And then there's the cognitive component where you are constantly thinking about work and you can't shut it off, right? So it's not just about long hours. That's just a piece of it. And so, I talk about, and like you mentioned, there's some self-assessments that you could take to see, do I have some of these workaholic tendencies? And so I go into that a little bit more. And, I think even if you only relate to one or two of these, it's still worth thinking about how you might want to implement some changes, because each one of these things individually has been linked to negative health and well-being outcomes, right? So, even if you can only relate to the long work hours component, and otherwise you're just a fully engaged worker, anything can be taken to the extreme. And the research is very clear that long work hours is detrimental for your health in the long run. And so, so I think that's how I think about workaholism and how to think about, do you relate to these, having these sorts of tendencies towards work?
I'm curious about one area that you mentioned, which is I can't stop thinking about it.
Mm-hmm.
And I just think about how the brain works and where ideas come from, and this idea that we're all inundated with challenges, problems, puzzles, questions, ideas. How would I have done this? You see somebody do something that you feel is ridiculous in your brain, you're ruminating over, what would I have done? Or there's this big project that you're working on and you're ideating. The brain, I don't know if the question is, how do we stop that? I don't know if the question is, should we stop that? It might be a very healthy way to actually keep your cognition and keep yourself young. I don't even know what the science would be around that. And I'm not asking you to define what would make it unhealthy or not, but the question is still, how or why should we stop thinking about these things that are obviously important because they're on our brain?
Mm-hmm.
And it would be unhealthy to stop thinking about it.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not saying we shouldn't think about work ever when we're not working, because sometimes those creative bursts do come. I might be taking a walk around the block and all of a sudden I just had this, really great research idea. And so I come home and I jot it down. That kind of thing is organic and that happens. But I will say that there is some solid research showing that psychological detachment from work, which is kind of shutting that off in your brain, it leads to a whole host of positive outcomes: work engagement the next day, restful sleep that evening, so that, again, you're ready to hit the ground rolling. There's also some other research that is kind of related to the mindfulness space, showing that people are happier when they're in the moment and not thinking about the past or the present, or I'm sorry, the past or the future, right? So if you're constantly thinking about your work, you're thinking about things that happened, you're thinking about things that will happen and how you're going to, accomplish that. You're not in the moment. And the research is clear that you're happier in the moment. I mean, this is very related to the idea of mindfulness and being present. And so that research, the research on psychological detachment and the healthy benefits of that, I think you need to allow some of that in your life. It is not healthy to constantly be thinking about work.
Right. We also have a huge cultural shift. We talked a little bit about it earlier, but I want to expand on it, of hustle culture.
Oh, yeah.
Right, this idea of, you're working hard, you're barely getting by, look around your house, you could sell those Beanie Baby dolls, you could do Facebook Marketplace, you have an art that you love doing, you could sell it on Etsy, if you like baking muffins, everything has some type of economical output. I even think of, I'm a big collectible person, as you could probably see. And I watch my kids, they don't just buy Pokemon cards. They now want to build a business around selling and buying. And by the way, there's a lot of affirmation for them online about it. People making millions of dollars in very different ways of selling, even something like Pokemon cards. You'd be fascinated to see, like, it's single cards, it's overstock, it's graded cards, it's unpacked, it's fully packaged. And part of me loves this idea of finding something you like and building a business around it and learning these, like, there's value on both sides. But the other part of it is, some of us just played guitar or bass or piano because we loved playing with it. We didn't think that we could post videos online and then have them go viral and then teach people how to play piano. Like, it seems like this crazy cycle of, you can do the hobby, you can do the thing that doesn't have a destination or an end or an economical attachment to it, and that would add value to your life. And you could do all of those things and make money and build a business. And I think about, like, is that bad? Is it good? But I could see the overworked components of never not working, like have a direct effect on an individual who's realizing, I can make money doing things I like on top of my work. How great.
Yeah. And I definitely see your point, and I see both sides again with this, because I tend to also be of that mindset of, what's my side hustle? And I see that in my son too. He, as a kid, even I remember one time he took all these little trinkets like pencils and eraser caps and gathered them all up and went around the block selling them for like $1 or $2 a piece. And just thinking of ways to take, an afternoon to make some extra money. And in one sense, I'm proud of him, right? Yeah. And I'm like, look at you, future entrepreneur. But on the other hand, I'm like, I wonder if I'm modeling some of this to him, and if this is sort of my fault too. So I do think it can be great to have hobbies. It could also be a nice perk to be able to make some money off of those hobbies and passions. With everything, I think it comes down to, everything can be taken to the extreme. And, one woman I interviewed for the book, she's a therapist, but as a side hustle, it started out just as a side project. She was writing a script for this HBO pilot, and it was turning into this obsession for her. And she was spending hours and hours, and it was almost like a second full-time job. And she said to me that she was grateful that it didn't get picked up, because she was just spending so much time. And it started out just as a fun hobby, So I think it's great to have these things, but it's also, if you tend to be the type of person that a hobby turns into an obsession, then you probably do have some of these workaholic tendencies. And it's just important to keep that in mind and self-reflect and think, are there some things that I can tweak about my life to be able to make sure that I'm implementing some sort of balance?
Part of my takeaway from the book too was this idea that it is like psychology, in the sense of, it's very personalized, that every person is going to have a different definition, different boundaries. Their enablers are going to be very, very different. And for some, it might be the worst thing that's ever happened to them and send them into this workaholism. And for others, it might be the greatest way for them to achieve. And they are achieving things that are otherworldly, or things we may not have seen before. And I think that's what makes your work really challenging, because I think these conversations really demonstrate that it's not a one size fits all. In fact, I'd even argue that the biggest thing post pandemic we've seen is that work and the job has become extremely individualized and personalized. And the challenge leaders have is they're not just managing a team, they're really managing individuals and their tastes and flavors, from the person who can't show up at 8 because they have a gym to the person who will be there at 6 because they want to maybe finish earlier and then go to the gym and go visit family, or go be a caregiver for a loved one. I really empathize. I know it's going to sound crazy with leaders today. I think it's a really hard job to lead teams with so much of these ideas being in the marketplace.
I totally agree. I do. It's very challenging for leaders. And I do think, many leaders aren't, trained to kind of be able to manage in this new way. And so that's just, wake up call for organizations to help provide more training and more of these developmental experiences, because we're not perfect. It takes practice. It's, not just going to naturally come to everyone. And, so like you said, empathy is a key thing too. And I study empathy as well, in my research. And it does really help you to better understand what your employees are struggling with and how they can be the most effective, and how you can best help your team if you really take that time to understand everyone's perspectives. And that's a skill.
Yeah. I feel like every leader needs to become a life coach in one way, shape, or form.
It almost feels like that sometimes, doesn't it?
Yeah. In fact, in that clip I was talking about earlier from Simon Sinek, he makes this kind of joke that bosses are now priests, therapists, parents.
It's a big role.
People are coming to them, not even talk about work things, but how they're having trouble in life, and this willingness or ability for them to cogently help these people through is really challenging for a lot of people.
Yeah, absolutely. I know I feel that way too as an advisor to my graduate students. It was just not the way things were decade or two ago, or just back in the day. It just wasn't. That was the exception, not the rule. And I feel like now it's definitely how it's just the new way of mentoring, of being in my case, an advisor to graduate students. So
I'm curious your thoughts on boredom, daydreaming, just being alone with your own thoughts. I know how I feel about it personally, and I think it's done me real good. I also see how the younger generation just can't. And I would even argue, to be fair, that I see my peers too that can't. That if there's a moment, they're reaching for the phone, looking at their Apple Watch. They are not trying to engage with the environment. They're trying to detach from the environment and check their LinkedIn feeds.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on how we reconcile that, or how we learn to let those moments in? I think part of the challenges we're having is that people don't have the time to think in a world that is quarter by quarter, that's pushing us further and further.
Yeah, I think it's just so tempting that, even knowing what all the research says, I'm still tempted and I still struggle with that. So it's almost like you have to build in those moments of just nothingness, into the organization, into your daily life. And I also see it with my kids too, it's just very different than when we were kids, right? And just having to kill time and figure out how to occupy ourselves for hours, right? It's just so different. And I do worry that especially the next generation coming up is going to really struggle with having any sort of downtime. And that is one of the things that I talk about in the book, is that just being idle is so difficult for so many people. And it takes a conscious effort to do that.
Yeah, I think the rise of the entire mindfulness world is the replacement for our own ability to simply daydream or be idle or not do anything or stare out the window, that again, we look to do something.
You're
And
right.
perhaps we found it in a 20-minute headspace session. Perhaps we
Yeah,
did,
maybe.
but,
I
but who
admit
knows?
I struggle. I'm not a good meditation person. I really struggle with making it work for me, and I know I just need to practice more. But yeah, you're right. It's like that's still not doing nothing. You're still
And you're gamifying it. It's like, how long did I meditate for and how many days of a streak? I'm like, we're not
right.
doing it. Again,
Yes.
it's like this hustle thing, right? Of like,
Yeah.
I need a
Right.
badge in order to feel like I did nothing.
Yep. Yeah, I know. All great points.
So, Melissa, tell me the one thing that made you think differently.
I think, especially recent, talking to the individuals for my book, it was, my whole career has been doing academic research, and participants were always kind of an arm's length away, right? We looked at aggregate scores on job satisfaction and performance, but doing these interviews on a personal one-on-one level, it really made me realize that there are humans behind this research, and it really does personally impact people. And there's so much that I can learn from just one-on-one conversations. So to me, that really changed my perspective of what is useful research. I think again, I was taught under the model that you need to have best practices and all the correct methodologies, but sometimes just those personal conversations, totally unstructured, are what really inspires so many new ideas that I don't know if I would have gotten through the typical research that I had been doing.
I love that because it speaks to hopefully an evolution and how we speak to people and build data and science. It's perfect. So the new book is called Never Not Working, Thinkers 50 Radar List. I know we didn't have a chance to talk about it, but you have the Healthy Work Lab as well. Can you let people know where they can find out more about you? And if you're sharing content online, what's the platform and where to find you?
Sure, we can connect on LinkedIn, but I also have a website. It's melissaclark.com, but my name's spelled a little weird, so it's MALISSACLARK. So they can come to that website and connect with me there.
That's great. Well, thanks so much for your time.
Thank you for having me.